is a version of you right now that the world is quietly wearing down, in ways so small and so gradual that you may not even notice it happening until years have already passed. It happens when you let your best work speak for itself, instead of ever claiming credit for it, and watch someone louder walk away with the recognition you actually earned. It happens when you open up to someone far too early, handing them pieces of yourself before they have shown any evidence they know how to hold them carefully. It happens when you let a small, unresolved tension with someone sit untouched for months, hoping it will simply dissolve on its own, only to watch it quietly poison an entire relationship instead. None of this happens to you because you are weak, or foolish, or somehow deserving of it. It happens because the world, left entirely to its own devices, does not reward the people who deserve good outcomes. It rewards the people who understand how the game is actually played, and quietly punishes everyone else through 1,000 small, cumulative losses that rarely announce themselves as a single dramatic event. 500 years ago, a sharp, unsentimental observer of Renaissance politics named Niccolò Machiavelli watched this exact dynamic play out again and again, among rulers, courtiers, and rivals, locked in a constant, high-stakes struggle for survival, and he drew a conclusion that remains uncomfortably true today. The world does not break the ruthless. It breaks the soft, the predictable, the endlessly patient, and the quietly self-sacrificing, over and over, until they either learn how to protect themselves, or they do not make it through the process fully intact. Today on The Hidden Mind, we are going to walk through exactly how the world breaks people, in ways most of us never learn to recognize until the damage is already done, and exactly what Machiavelli believed you needed to become instead. Welcome to The Hidden Mind, the channel dedicated to uncovering the real mechanics of power, psychology, and human nature, hiding beneath the surface of everyday life, the patterns quietly shaping outcomes long before most people ever learn to notice them clearly. If you are new here, you should know that this is not a channel built around comfortable, feel-good answers about how the world is supposed to work. This is a channel built around how it actually works, so that you are never caught off guard by it again. Today's video sits at the very center of everything Machiavelli spent his life studying: the uncomfortable, difficult-to-accept truth that the world is not a fair, self-correcting system that eventually rewards good intentions and punishes bad ones. It is a competitive, frequently indifferent arena that tends to reward decisiveness, self-advocacy, and firm boundaries, while it steadily, quietly wears down softness, predictability, and endless self-sacrifice until there is nothing left of the person who once carried those qualities so generously. We are going to walk through exactly how this happens, one pattern at a time, and exactly what Machiavelli believed the antidote to be: a specific, deliberate kind of ruthlessness that is not about becoming cruel or heartless, but about becoming someone the world simply cannot quietly grind down anymore. Before we begin, I want to ask you for a few small things that genuinely matter to this channel and the community forming around it. If today's video gives you even a single moment of real clarity about your own life, please take a couple of seconds to hit the like button. It is the simplest, most direct way to help this video reach the people who need to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us honestly, has the world broken a part of you that you are still working to rebuild? We read every single comment, and this community genuinely shapes the direction of what we create here each week. If you know someone who keeps getting hurt by the same recurring patterns, someone too quiet about their own achievements, too quick to overshare with the wrong people, too willing to let conflict fester instead of resolving it, share this video with them. It might be exactly the perspective shift they have been needing. And if you have not yet subscribed to The Hidden Mind, please do so now and turn on notifications, because we release a brand new deep dive into power, psychology, and human nature every single week, and this is a conversation you will want to stay part of consistently. Finally, if this channel has provided real value to you, please consider supporting our work directly with a super thanks using the button below this video. Every single contribution genuinely helps us continue building this project. Now, let's talk about exactly how the world breaks people and exactly what it takes to finally stop being one of them. The comfortable lie we are all raised on. Nearly everyone is handed some version of the same reassuring story during childhood. Do good, quiet work, and it will eventually be noticed. Open your heart honestly to others, and honesty will be met with honesty in return. Let small conflicts pass without confrontation, and time will smooth them over naturally. Give generously of yourself, and the universe will find some way to balance the books eventually. This story is comforting precisely because it is simple, and because believing it makes the world feel considerably safer, more orderly, and more fundamentally fair than it frequently turns out to actually be. Machiavelli, writing from the genuinely painful vantage point of a man who had lost his position, his reputation, and very nearly his life to the shifting tides of Renaissance political fortune, arrived at a starkly different conclusion about how the world actually distributes its rewards and punishments. He observed, again and again, across the courts and conflicts he witnessed and personally endured, that quiet, unclaimed competence is routinely overlooked in favor of confident, visible performance, regardless of which one is actually more substantial. That emotional openness offered before it has been earned is frequently met not with matching vulnerability, but with quiet exploitation from people who correctly sense an opportunity. That unresolved conflict, left alone in the hope that time will dissolve it naturally, tends instead to calcify into permanent, unaddressed resentment. And that generosity offered without any expectation of reciprocity is, more often than comfortable stories admit, simply absorbed without acknowledgement by people who have learned, through repeated experience, that it costs them nothing to keep receiving without ever giving anything back. This does not mean the reassuring story taught to most of us as children is entirely without value. Quiet competence, genuine openness, patience with conflict, and generosity of spirit remain real, worthwhile qualities, and this video is not an argument for abandoning them. But Machiavelli's insight, the insight we are exploring today, is that these qualities require deliberate protection and strategic timing in order to survive contact with a world that does not automatically honor them. The comfortable version of the story promises it will. Left entirely unprotected, these same virtues become precisely the vulnerabilities that allow the world to slowly break a person, one overlooked achievement, one exploited vulnerability, one unresolved conflict, one unreciprocated sacrifice at a time. Understanding exactly how this breaking process unfolds is the necessary first step toward protecting yourself from it, and that is where we turn our attention now. The world breaks you by rewarding confident performance over quiet competence. The first way the world breaks people concerns one of the more quietly demoralizing patterns a genuinely skilled, hard-working person can encounter: the discovery that raw competence, no matter how genuine or substantial, is routinely overlooked in favor of confident, visible self-presentation, regardless of whether that confidence is actually backed by comparable substance underneath it. Machiavelli understood this dynamic with striking clarity, having watched countless court advisors and political figures rise, not necessarily on the strength of their actual judgment or capability, but on the strength of how persuasively and visibly they presented themselves to the people whose approval and patronage actually mattered. Consider how relentlessly this pattern plays out in ordinary modern workplaces. A genuinely skilled employee quietly produces excellent work month after month, assuming, reasonably enough, that consistent quality will eventually be noticed and rewarded without any need for active self-promotion. Meanwhile, a considerably less skilled but far more visibly confident colleague speaks up assertively in every meeting, takes credit generously for collaborative work, and actively manages how their contributions are perceived by leadership, and often, frustratingly, advances considerably faster than the quieter, more substantively skilled colleague. Precisely because visibility and perceived confidence frequently carry more practical weight in career advancement than quiet, unclaimed competence ever does on its own. This is not a fair or admirable feature of how organizations and social hierarchies actually function, and Machiavelli would not have pretended otherwise. But recognizing this uncomfortable reality clearly is considerably more useful than continuing to operate according to the comfortable assumption that quiet excellence will inevitably be recognized without any active effort on your part to ensure that it actually is. The world breaks quietly competent people through this pattern relentlessly, not through any single dramatic injustice, but through years of watching less substantial work receive more recognition, more resources, and more opportunity, simply because that work was presented more visibly and more confidently than their own genuinely superior contributions ever were. Machiavelli's antidote here does not require becoming someone who exaggerates their accomplishments dishonestly or takes credit for work that genuinely belongs to others. It requires developing the considerably more modest, considerably more achievable skill of accurately, confidently, and visibly communicating your genuine contributions to the people whose recognition actually matters for your advancement, rather than assuming that recognition will simply arrive on its own without any active effort. This means speaking up clearly about your own work in meetings and performance reviews, rather than waiting to be asked. It means ensuring that credit for collaborative projects is distributed accurately, including your own genuine contribution, rather than allowing a more assertive colleague to claim disproportionate credit by default, simply because they spoke up first and more confidently. This shift feels genuinely uncomfortable for many quietly competent people, because it can feel, in the moment, like arrogance or self-promotion for its own sake. But there remains a meaningful, important difference between dishonest self-aggrandizement and accurate, confident communication of genuine value. And learning to practice the second, without collapsing into either false modesty or genuine dishonesty, is precisely the skill that protects quietly competent people from being repeatedly, unfairly overlooked in favor of louder, less substantial performances. The world breaks you through emotional overexposure to people who haven't earned it. The second way the world breaks people concerns the pacing and timing of emotional vulnerability, a subject Machiavelli approached with the same cold, clear-eyed strategic thinking he applied to political alliances and rivalries. He observed, through repeated example among the courtiers and rulers he studied closely, that individuals who revealed their genuine fears, ambitions, and vulnerabilities too quickly, before the person receiving that vulnerability had demonstrated any real evidence of trustworthiness, consistently found those revelations eventually used against them, whether through outright betrayal, casual carelessness, or simple exploitation of a weakness that should never have been shared so freely in the first place. Consider how naturally this pattern unfolds in ordinary modern relationships. A new romantic connection feels exciting and genuinely promising, and within the first few weeks, one person shares their deepest insecurities, their most painful past experiences, and their most private hopes and fears, driven by genuine excitement and a natural desire for closeness, only to watch those same vulnerabilities later weaponized during an argument, or worse, casually shared with others outside the relationship entirely, precisely because the trust required to safely hold that vulnerability had never actually been established through demonstrated, consistent behavior over time before it was offered so freely. A new friendship develops quickly, built on genuine warmth and easy conversation, and one person shares significant personal struggles, financial difficulties, or family conflicts far earlier than the friendship's actual depth would reasonably warrant, only to discover later that this information has been shared further, gossiped about, or subtly used to establish an uncomfortable power imbalance within the relationship. This is one of the more painful, quietly devastating ways the world breaks genuinely open, emotionally generous people. Because the very openness that makes them capable of real intimacy and connection also makes them acutely vulnerable to exploitation by people who have not yet earned access to that openness, and who may never have intended to honor it responsibly in the first place. Machiavelli's antidote here is not an argument for permanent emotional guardedness or an inability to ever form genuine, close connection with others. It is an argument for pacing, for allowing emotional vulnerability to deepen gradually, in proportion to demonstrated trustworthiness observed over real time, rather than offering the deepest, most sensitive parts of yourself immediately, based purely on how a new relationship feels in its earliest, most exciting stages. This means noticing, with real honesty, your own tendency to overshare quickly when a new connection feels promising, and practicing the genuinely difficult discipline of holding back your deepest vulnerabilities until a relationship has actually demonstrated, through consistent behavior over a meaningful stretch of time, that it can be trusted to hold them carefully. This pacing protects your genuine capacity for deep, authentic connection over the long term, by ensuring that this capacity is directed toward relationships that have actually earned and will genuinely honor it, rather than being repeatedly, painfully exploited by people who were never going to treat that vulnerability with the care it deserved in the first place. The world breaks you by letting necessary conflict rot instead of resolving it. The third way the world breaks people concerns the specific, quietly corrosive damage caused by avoiding necessary conflict, allowing tension, disagreement, or genuine grievance to sit unaddressed for far longer than the situation actually warranted, in the comfortable but ultimately mistaken hope that avoidance itself would somehow resolve what direct confrontation never got the chance to address. Machiavelli observed, throughout his study of political alliances and rivalries, that conflicts left deliberately unaddressed rarely resolved themselves through the simple passage of time, and instead tended to deepen and calcify, accumulating additional layers of resentment, misunderstanding, and mistrust the longer they were allowed to persist without any genuine attempt at resolution. Consider how relentlessly this pattern shows up in ordinary personal and professional relationships. A workplace disagreement over responsibilities or credit goes unaddressed for months, both parties quietly resentful, but neither willing to raise the issue directly, until the accumulated tension eventually erupts, often over some minor, unrelated trigger, into a conflict considerably larger and more damaging than the original, much smaller disagreement would have ever produced if it had simply been addressed honestly and directly at the time it first arose. A family tension over an old grievance goes unspoken for years, surfacing only in passive-aggressive comments and subtle avoidance during family gatherings, poisoning the overall relationship slowly and steadily in a way that a single, difficult, honest conversation early on would very likely have prevented entirely. The world breaks people who consistently avoid necessary conflict through this exact mechanism, a slow, cumulative erosion of relationships and personal well-being that no single dramatic event ever quite explains, because the damage was never caused by one event, it was caused by years of accumulated avoidance, each small instance adding another quiet layer to a foundation of resentment that eventually became too large and too deeply embedded to resolve easily. Machiavelli's antidote here requires a genuine, deliberate willingness to address necessary conflict directly and relatively promptly, rather than allowing avoidance to become the default, comfortable response to any disagreement or tension that arises. This does not mean manufacturing conflict where none genuinely exists, or confronting every minor irritation the instant it occurs without any discernment about which issues genuinely warrant direct address. It means developing an honest, ongoing awareness of which tensions in your current relationships have been quietly avoided for far longer than they should have been, and building the specific, practical courage required to raise those issues directly, clearly, and relatively promptly before avoidance allows them to calcify into something considerably harder to resolve. This discipline feels genuinely uncomfortable for many people who have been conditioned to view conflict avoidance as politeness or emotional maturity. But Machiavelli's clear-eyed observation was that avoided conflict rarely disappears, it simply changes shape, becoming a quieter, more insidious form of damage that ultimately proves far more corrosive to a relationship than the original, honestly addressed disagreement would ever have been. The world breaks you through total predictability. The fourth way the world breaks people concerns a genuinely uncomfortable truth about the cost of being fully, reliably predictable in every single interaction and relationship. A truth Machiavelli understood with unusual clarity given how consistently modern culture equates predictability with trustworthiness and reliability as unambiguous virtues. Machiavelli observed that while consistency in core values and fundamental character remained genuinely important, becoming so fully predictable in your specific responses to conflict, provocation, and negotiation that everyone around you could reliably anticipate exactly how you would react in any given situation created a genuine, exploitable vulnerability, because people who can accurately predict your response gain significant strategic advantage in shaping their own behavior specifically to work around that predictable response. Consider how naturally this pattern develops in ordinary personal and professional relationships. A person who is known, reliably and consistently, to always avoid confrontation and always accommodate others' demands, however reasonable or unreasonable those demands might be, becomes a person whose predictable accommodation gets quietly, sometimes unconsciously, factored into how others plan their own requests and behavior, precisely because everyone around them has learned, through repeated observation, that pushing this person's boundaries carries essentially no real risk of meaningful pushback. A person who is known to always forgive quickly and completely, regardless of how significant the original offense, becomes a person whose predictable forgiveness removes any genuine incentive for others to consider the consequences of their behavior toward them, because the consequence, whatever it might otherwise have been, has already been reliably, predictably removed from the equation in advance. This dynamic operates whether or not the people exploiting it are consciously, deliberately doing so, because human behavior naturally adjusts to predictable patterns in the people around us, whether that adjustment happens through deliberate calculation or simple, unconscious habit formed through repeated observation over time. The world breaks predictable people specifically through this mechanism, a slow, steady erosion of boundaries and consequences that occurs precisely because everyone around them has learned exactly what to expect and has adjusted their own behavior accordingly, entirely at the predictable person's expense. Machiavelli's antidote here does not require becoming genuinely erratic, unreliable, or inconsistent in ways that damage trust with the people who genuinely deserve your consistency, your closest relationships, your core professional reliability, your fundamental values should all remain genuinely steady and dependable. What becomes strategically less predictable is specifically your response to conflict, provocation, and testing behavior from people looking to exploit a reliably accommodating pattern, introducing genuine, deliberate variation into how and whether you respond to boundary testing, so that the people around you can no longer reliably calculate, in advance, exactly how far they can push before encountering meaningful resistance. The world breaks you by making comfort feel safer than necessary change. The fifth way the world breaks people concerns the quiet, seductive pull of comfort itself, and the way this pull frequently masquerades as caution, prudence, or simple contentment, even when it is actually functioning as a slow, steady form of stagnation that gradually erodes a person's capability, confidence, and options over time. Machiavelli, writing about the political fortunes of rulers who failed to adapt to changing circumstances, observed a pattern that applies with equal force to individual lives, that comfort, however genuinely pleasant it feels in the present moment, tends to discourage exactly the kind of ongoing growth, skill development, and adaptability that eventually becomes essential when circumstances inevitably shift, as they always eventually do, in ways that comfort itself never adequately prepares a person to handle. Consider how naturally this pattern develops across an ordinary career or life trajectory. A person settles comfortably into a familiar role, a familiar set of responsibilities, a familiar level of skill and challenge, and the comfort of that familiarity gradually discourages the continued learning, skill development, and calculated risk-taking that originally built whatever competence and security they currently enjoy. This comfort feels, in the moment, like a genuinely reasonable, even wise choice, avoiding unnecessary risk and disruption in favor of stable, predictable contentment. But this same comfort quietly erodes the person's adaptability and marketable capability over time, so that when circumstances eventually, inevitably shift, a company restructuring, an industry disruption, a personal crisis requiring new skills and flexibility, the comfortable person discovers, often at the worst possible moment, that years of comfortable stagnation have left them considerably less prepared to adapt than they would have been had they continued actively developing their capability throughout the comfortable period, rather than allowing that comfort to quietly discourage further growth. The world breaks comfortable people through this exact mechanism, not through any single dramatic failure, but through a slow, gradual erosion of adaptability and capability that comfort itself actively encourages, precisely because comfort feels safe, in a way that active, ongoing growth and calculated risk-taking simply does not, even though the comfortable path frequently proves considerably more dangerous over the longer term than the genuinely uncomfortable path of continued deliberate growth. Machiavelli's antidote here requires a genuine, ongoing willingness to seek out productive discomfort even during periods of relative stability and comfort, treating comfortable periods specifically as an opportunity to continue developing skill, capability, and adaptability, rather than as a signal that active development and growth are no longer necessary simply because current circumstances happen to feel stable and secure in the present moment. This requires a specific kind of discipline that runs directly against the natural, comfortable pull towards simply enjoying stability when it arrives, and instead treats every period of comfort as precisely the moment to actively invest in skills, relationships, and capabilities that will matter considerably more once that comfort inevitably shifts, as comfortable circumstances always eventually do for absolutely everyone over the course of a full life. The world breaks you through silent self-sacrifice nobody asked for. The sixth and final way we will discuss today concerns a particular, quietly painful pattern that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately as a genuine strategic error: the habit of sacrificing your own needs, resources, and well-being repeatedly for the benefit of others, without ever actually confirming that this sacrifice was wanted, needed, or would even be reciprocated in any meaningful way. Consider how naturally this pattern develops in ordinary family and personal relationships. A person quietly absorbs the majority of caregiving responsibilities within a family, repeatedly sacrificing their own time, career opportunities, and personal well-being, without ever directly asking whether this sacrifice is genuinely necessary or whether it could be shared more equitably among other capable family members who have simply never been asked to contribute more. Because the self-sacrificing person has never actually raised the possibility directly, instead simply absorbing the responsibility silently out of a genuine but ultimately self-defeating sense of obligation. A person consistently prioritizes a friend's or partner's needs and preferences over their own, silently assuming this sacrifice is appreciated and will eventually be reciprocated, without ever actually communicating their own needs clearly enough for the other person to even recognize that a genuine sacrifice is being made on their behalf at all. This particular pattern of breaking is especially painful because it frequently goes entirely unrecognized by the people benefiting from it, not necessarily out of deliberate exploitation, but simply because silent sacrifice, by its very nature, often remains invisible to the person receiving its benefits, who may have no clear awareness that a genuine cost is being absorbed quietly on their behalf, precisely because that cost was never communicated directly rather than simply assumed and silently endured. The world breaks silently self-sacrificing people through this exact mechanism, a slow, cumulative depletion of personal resources, time, and well-being that produces genuine resentment over time. Resentment that feels deeply unfair and confusing to the person experiencing it, because from their perspective, they have been generously sacrificing for others who never even seem to notice or appreciate what was actually being given up on their behalf. Machiavelli's antidote here requires a genuinely uncomfortable but necessary shift, replacing silent, assumed sacrifice with direct, explicit communication about what you are actually willing and able to give, and ensuring that genuine sacrifice, when it does occur, happens by clear mutual agreement rather than by silent, unspoken assumption that the other party will simply recognize and reciprocate a cost they were never actually informed was being paid on their behalf in the first place. This does not mean abandoning genuine generosity or care for the people who matter most in your life. It means ensuring that this generosity is offered consciously and communicated clearly, rather than silently assumed and quietly resented when it inevitably goes unacknowledged or unreciprocated by people who, quite reasonably, cannot appreciate a sacrifice they were never actually told was being made. Where ruthlessness ends and cruelty begins. Having walked through 6 distinct ways the world quietly breaks people, and 6 corresponding antidotes drawn from Machiavelli's cold, clear-eyed observation of human nature, it is essential that we pause here and address directly a critical distinction that is far too often lost when people first encounter this kind of philosophy: the distinction between genuine, healthy ruthlessness deployed in service of self-protection and genuine cruelty deployed at the expense of people who have done nothing to deserve that treatment. Ruthlessness, in the sense we are describing throughout today's video, means visibly, accurately claiming credit for your own genuine contributions rather than allowing quiet competence to be overlooked indefinitely. It means pacing your emotional vulnerability according to demonstrated trustworthiness, rather than offering it freely to anyone who feels exciting or promising in the moment. It means addressing necessary conflict directly and promptly, rather than allowing avoidance to let resentment calcify into something considerably harder to resolve later. It means introducing genuine strategic unpredictability into how you respond to boundary testing, rather than remaining so reliably predictable that everyone around you learns exactly how far they can push you without consequence. It means treating comfortable periods as opportunities for continued growth rather than as permission to stagnate. And it means replacing silent, assumed self-sacrifice with direct, clearly communicated generosity offered by genuine choice rather than silent, unspoken obligation. Notice that every single one of these 6 principles is fundamentally protective and self-advocating in nature. They are about ensuring your genuine contributions, boundaries, and generosity are recognized, respected, and reciprocated appropriately, rather than being quietly overlooked, exploited, or taken for granted by a world that will happily allow all of that to happen if you let it. Cruelty, by sharp contrast, involves actively seeking to harm, deceive, exploit, or diminish other people who have done nothing to deserve that treatment, purely for personal gain, ego satisfaction, or a sense of power over them. This is not what Machiavelli's philosophy, properly understood, actually advocates for, despite the dark, often exaggerated reputation that has followed his name through the centuries. The genuinely ruthless person we are describing throughout this video does not go looking for opportunities to exploit or harm people who have done nothing wrong. They simply refuse to remain a passive, endlessly available target for a world that will happily exploit quiet competence, unpaced vulnerability, avoided conflict, total predictability, comfortable stagnation, and silent self-sacrifice, if given the sustained opportunity to do so. Building your ruthless core, starting today. Understanding this philosophy intellectually is a meaningful first step, but genuinely building the internal discipline and self-protective instincts described throughout today's video requires deliberate, ongoing practice, not simply a single moment of intellectual agreement with the ideas presented here. Begin with an honest audit of your own life, identifying specifically where each of the 6 breaking patterns discussed today shows up most clearly for you personally. Where has your own genuine competence gone quietly unrecognized because you assumed it would speak for itself without any active communication on your part? Where have you shared significant emotional vulnerability with someone before they had genuinely earned access to it through demonstrated, consistent, trustworthy behavior over real time? Where has a necessary, overdue conflict been sitting unaddressed in your life, quietly accumulating resentment while you waited for it to somehow resolve itself without any direct confrontation? Where has your own reliable, predictable pattern of accommodation been quietly exploited by people who have learned exactly what they can get away with because you have never once introduced any genuine unpredictability into your responses? Where has a period of genuine comfort in your life gradually become a period of quiet stagnation, your skills and adaptability slowly eroding, while the comfort itself felt entirely safe and reasonable in the moment? And where have you been silently sacrificing your own time, resources, or well-being for someone who was never actually informed that a genuine sacrifice was being made on their behalf at all? This honest audit, uncomfortable as it may be to conduct with genuine rigor, is the essential first step, because you cannot deliberately change patterns you have not first clearly identified and acknowledged with real honesty in your own specific life. Once you have identified where these patterns show up most significantly for you, choose one area to focus your deliberate practice on initially, rather than attempting to overhaul every single pattern simultaneously, which tends to produce overwhelm rather than genuine, sustainable change. Practice small, concrete steps within whichever area you have chosen, speaking up clearly about a genuine contribution in your next meeting, if quiet competence is your primary pattern, deliberately slowing the pace of emotional disclosure in a new relationship if overexposure is your primary pattern, scheduling one overdue, honest conversation if avoided conflict is your primary pattern, introducing one small, deliberate variation into how you respond to a familiar boundary test if predictability is your primary pattern, committing to one new skill or challenge if comfortable stagnation is your primary pattern, and having one direct, honest conversation about reciprocity if silent self-sacrifice is your primary pattern. None of these practices will feel comfortable initially, and that discomfort is not evidence that you are doing something wrong. It is simply the natural, expected friction that comes from deliberately working against patterns that have likely been reinforced, often unconsciously, for years or even decades of your life. A final reflection on becoming unbreakable. Before we close today's video, it is worth sitting honestly with what this entire philosophy is actually working to protect. Because it is not, at its core, simply about winning, about accumulating advantage, or about outmaneuvering the people around you for its own sake. It is about protecting your genuine capacity to remain a substantive, connected, generous human being over the full course of a lifetime, in a world that will happily exploit exactly those qualities if you allow it to do so without any strategic protection or discernment. The tragedy this philosophy is actually working to prevent is not the tragedy of becoming too soft or too kind. It is the far more common and far more painful tragedy of a genuinely capable, genuinely generous person slowly, repeatedly overlooked, exploited, and depleted until they eventually shut down entirely, becoming permanently guarded, permanently resentful, and genuinely unable to offer the competence, openness, and generosity they once carried so freely, precisely because none of it was ever adequately protected while it still had the chance to be. The 6 principles we have discussed today, visible self-advocacy, paced vulnerability, timely conflict resolution, strategic unpredictability, deliberate growth during comfort, and conscious rather than silent generosity, are not meant to close you off from the world. They are meant to be the protective structure that allows your genuine competence, openness, and generosity to survive contact with a world that does not automatically honor those qualities the way we are often taught to expect it will. The world will, indeed, break the person who moves through it with no self-advocacy, no discernment about vulnerability, no willingness to address conflict directly, total predictability, comfortable stagnation, and endless silent sacrifice. But it does not have to break you, not if you are willing to build, deliberately and with real, sustained practice over time, the quiet, protective ruthlessness that Machiavelli spent his life studying and ultimately trying to embody as best he could in his own difficult, turbulent life. Why this philosophy feels so uncomfortable to accept. If parts of today's video have felt genuinely difficult to sit with, that discomfort deserves to be named directly rather than glossed over, because it tells you something real about why this philosophy remains so rarely discussed openly, despite how consistently useful it has proven across 5 centuries of recorded human experience since Machiavelli first committed it to paper. Most of us are raised with a deep, often unexamined attachment to the belief that the world operates according to some baseline principle of fairness, that quiet competence is eventually recognized, that generosity is eventually reciprocated, and that conflicts, left alone long enough, tend to resolve themselves naturally without requiring any uncomfortable direct confrontation. Letting go of this belief, even partially, even only in the specific, bounded way this video has described, can feel like a genuine loss, almost like grieving a more comfortable, more innocent way of understanding how relationships and careers are actually supposed to work. There is a real reason this belief feels so difficult to release, beyond simple habit or naivety. Believing in a fundamentally fair, self-correcting world offers genuine psychological comfort, a sense of order and predictability that makes daily life feel considerably less frightening than the alternative. A world where outcomes depend heavily on visible self-advocacy, careful pacing of trust, timely confrontation, strategic unpredictability, deliberate growth, and conscious rather than assumed generosity, rather than being reliably distributed according to who deserves them most in some abstract cosmic sense. Machiavelli did not write his work to strip away this comfort out of cruelty or cynicism for its own sake. He wrote it because he had personally witnessed, at devastating cost to his own career and reputation, exactly what happens to people who continue operating according to the comfortable version of the story after the world has already demonstrated, repeatedly and unmistakably, that it simply does not work that way. His own downfall came in part from political dynamics he had not adequately protected himself against, and the philosophy he spent the remainder of his life developing was, in a very real sense, the hard-won wisdom of a man determined to ensure that others might avoid the same painful lessons he had been forced to learn the difficult, costly way. There is a particular kind of grief that accompanies this realization for many genuinely thoughtful, conscientious people. A quiet mourning for the version of the world they once believed in, where sincerity was always met with sincerity, where quiet hard work always eventually received its due recognition, and where difficult conversations could simply be avoided indefinitely without any lasting cost. Allow yourself, honestly, to feel that grief if it arises while sitting with today's video, rather than rushing immediately past it toward the more strategic, protective mindset this philosophy ultimately offers. That grief is a genuine, understandable response to updating a belief that once felt foundational to how you understood your place in the world, and it does not need to be resolved instantly or dismissed as simple naivety in order to be honored as real. What tends to follow that initial grief, for most people who genuinely sit with these ideas over time, rather than rejecting them outright, is a considerably more settled, considerably more resilient way of moving through relationships, career, and everyday conflict, one built not on the comfortable hope that fairness will simply arrive on its own, but on the genuine, hard-won confidence that comes from knowing you are actively, deliberately, protecting your own competence, vulnerability, boundaries, and generosity, rather than leaving their fate entirely up to a world that has never once promised to handle them fairly on its own. Why these patterns rarely get named clearly until it is already too late. There is a specific reason these 6 breaking patterns tend to remain invisible for so long in most people's lives, only becoming clear in painful hindsight, often years after the actual damage has already accumulated. Each individual instance of quiet competence going unrecognized, each single moment of oversharing with someone who did not deserve it, each small conflict left unaddressed, each minor boundary quietly tested and conceded, each comfortable day spent without active growth, and each small silent sacrifice made without acknowledgement, feels genuinely insignificant in isolation. No single instance of any of these patterns typically feels like a crisis in the moment it occurs, and this is precisely why they prove so quietly dangerous over time. Because human beings are considerably better at recognizing and responding to single, dramatic threats than we are at recognizing the cumulative, compounding danger of small, repeated patterns that never individually cross a threshold significant enough to trigger genuine alarm or corrective action. This is why the honest audit described earlier in today's video matters so much, because it deliberately forces into conscious awareness patterns that would otherwise continue operating quietly in the background of your life indefinitely, each instance too small to notice on its own, but collectively powerful enough, over months and years, to produce exactly the kind of gradual breaking this entire video has been describing. Consider keeping a simple, ongoing awareness of these 6 patterns as you move through your daily life over the coming weeks, not through an obsessive, anxious monitoring of every single interaction, but through periodic, honest check-ins with yourself, perhaps once a week, asking simply whether any of these 6 patterns showed up in a way worth noticing during that particular stretch of time. This kind of ongoing, low-intensity awareness, practiced consistently over time, tends to catch these patterns considerably earlier than the alternative, waiting until the cumulative damage has become significant enough to finally demand your full attention, often at a point when considerably more repair work is required than would have been necessary had the pattern been caught and addressed much earlier in its development. There is one more thing worth naming honestly before we move to today's close. Building genuine fluency in these 6 principles takes considerably longer than the length of a single video, however clearly the ideas themselves might land in this moment. Expect an early, somewhat awkward phase where applying any of this feels stiff, overly deliberate, almost performative, a conscious effort layered on top of instincts that have operated automatically for years, or even decades. This awkwardness is not a sign that the philosophy does not fit you. It is simply the ordinary, expected texture of genuinely rewiring a deep behavioral pattern, rather than simply agreeing with an idea intellectually. Give yourself real permission to practice imperfectly, to occasionally revert to old patterns under real pressure, and to keep returning to these 6 principles deliberately, again and again, until the deliberate effort gradually settles into something closer to a genuine, comfortable instinct of its own. one that no longer requires the same conscious, effortful attention it demands right now, in these early, unfamiliar stages of actually putting it into practice. A final thought before you go. One last thing worth sitting with before this video ends. Of the 6 patterns discussed today, most people will recognize themselves clearly in at least 2 or 3, and that recognition can feel, in the first moment, uncomfortably exposing, almost like being seen more clearly than you expected to be by a stranger narrating a video. That discomfort is a genuinely good sign, not a bad one, because it usually means the pattern being described is landing close to something real and specific in your own actual life, rather than something abstract and easy to dismiss as irrelevant to you personally. Take that discomfort seriously enough to act on it in some small, concrete way this week, rather than letting it fade quietly the moment this video ends and ordinary life resumes its usual pace and pull. And that brings us to the end of today's exploration into exactly how the world breaks people and exactly what Machiavelli believed it takes to stop being one of them. Before we walk through the recap, it is worth remembering one final time that every principle discussed today exists specifically to protect the good, substantive, generous parts of who you already are, not to replace them with something colder or more transactional. The world breaks quiet competence by rewarding confident performance instead, and the antidote is visible, accurate self-advocacy for your own genuine contributions. The world breaks emotional openness offered too early to people who have not earned it, and the antidote is pacing your vulnerability according to demonstrated trustworthiness over real time. The world breaks relationships through avoided conflict left to quietly rot rather than resolved directly, and the antidote is addressing necessary tension promptly rather than allowing avoidance to calcify it into something considerably harder to fix. The world breaks total predictability by teaching everyone around you exactly how far they can push before meeting resistance, and the antidote is introducing genuine, deliberate unpredictability into how you respond to boundary testing. The world breaks comfortable stagnation by leaving you unprepared for change that arrives regardless of how safe the present moment feels, and the antidote is treating comfort as an active opportunity for continued growth rather than permission to stop developing. And the world breaks silent self-sacrifice offered without ever being asked for, and the antidote is replacing silent, assumed generosity with clear, conscious communication about what you are actually willing to give. Carry these 6 principles with you, not as a license to become cold or cruel toward the people who genuinely deserve your warmth, but as the protective structure that allows that warmth to survive and flourish over the full course of your life, rather than being slowly drained away by a world that will happily exploit it if you let it, one small, unnoticed instance at a time, until years have passed and the damage has become considerably harder to trace back to any single cause. Before you go, I want to ask you once again for a few small things that genuinely matter to this channel. If today's video gave you real clarity about your own life, please take a moment to hit the like button. It makes a real difference in helping this video reach more people who genuinely need it. Leave a comment below and let us know honestly which of these 6 patterns you recognized most clearly in your own life. We genuinely read every single comment, and this community genuinely shapes the direction of what we build here each week on The Hidden Mind. If you know someone who keeps getting broken by these exact same patterns, someone too quiet about their own achievements, too quick to overshare with people who have not earned it, too willing to let conflict fester instead of resolving it, too predictable, too comfortable, or too endlessly self-sacrificing for people who never even asked, please take a moment to share this video with them today. It might be exactly the perspective they have been needing to finally hear. And if you have not yet subscribed to The Hidden Mind, please do so now and turn on notifications, because we release a new deep dive into power, psychology, and human nature every single week, and this is a conversation you will want to remain part of consistently. Finally, if this channel has provided real, genuine value to you, please consider supporting our work directly with a super thanks using the button below this video. Every single contribution genuinely helps us continue building this project for you. Until next time, remember that the world will try to break the parts of you that stay quiet about your own worth. Open up too quickly, avoid necessary conflict, remain endlessly predictable, settle too comfortably into stagnation, and sacrifice silently for people who never asked. But it does not have to succeed. Not if you are willing to build the quiet, protective ruthlessness required to stop it. None of this happens overnight, and none of it requires you to abandon the fundamental generosity, warmth, and substance that make you who you are. It simply asks you to finally start protecting those qualities as deliberately as the world has always been testing them. This has been The Hidden Mind, and we will see you again in the next one.